CNN's chief White House correspondent Jim Acosta offers his firsthand account of covering the Trump administration. He's interviewed by Jay Rosen, founder of PressThink and New York University journalism professor. Afterwards is a weekly interview program with relevant guest hosts interviewing top nonfiction authors about their latest work.
Jim Acosta, thank you so much for doing this. Let's get right to it.
Thanks for having me.
Where are your people from? Where's your family from? How did they come to these shores?
Well, my dad is a Cuban immigrant. He came to this country in 1962, 3 weeks before the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was just 11 years old at the time, and he and my grandmother fled Cuba together. They originally landed in Miami, but then shortly after that moved up to the Washington, D.C. area, settled in Northern Virginia, which is where I'm from. My dad met my mom, who was an American of Irish and Czech descent. She was born in Washington, D.C. at the Women's Hospital in Washington over near Georgetown. Her parents, my grandparents, are buried over at Arlington National Cemetery. So my family is sort of a collision between Havana and Washington. My dad, gave me a lot of stories from his upbringing in Cuba. He talked about growing up on the island until he was about 11 years old and had to flee. And I still to this day have the passport that they gave to him, that the Cuban government gave him when he fled the country. And you can see the expression on his face. He just looks like a kid who's only 11 years old and is uncertain about where he's off to. But as I write in the book, The Enemy of the People, A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth in America, when he arrived in Northern Virginia, this was the first time that they had ever experienced winter. And there was a Presbyterian church in Northern Virginia that gave my dad and my grandmother, coats and sweaters and warm clothing so they could handle their first winter in Washington, D.C. So I always think about that, the compassion, the kindness that was shown to my Cuban side of the family when they got to the United States.
And how did your dad and you become citizens?
Well, I was born in Northern Virginia. I was born at Fairfax County Hospital, right outside the Beltway.
How did your family become citizens? Yeah, right. How did your family become citizens?
Well, they've been in this country, for some 50 years. My dad had to go through the immigration process, it's one of those things where I feel as though my family story is a lot like the other stories of other immigrant families across the country. My dad worked as a grocery store worker for 40 years until he couldn't stand anymore. Paid into Social Security and Medicare, and through a lot of hard work, earned his retirement. My mother, as I said, is an American. She worked in the restaurant business. My parents split up when I was just 5 years old, and I was essentially raised by a single mother, although my dad stayed in the picture and I saw him on the weekends. We're no strangers to hard work, which is one reason why I write in the book when I go to Trump rallies. I feel like I can relate to a lot of Trump supporters just as well, and dare I say better than the man they came to see. And I find it interesting talking to a lot of folks who come to these rallies because I feel like I relate to them in more ways than they know.
Where did you grow up? In Northern Virginia? Did you have interests in journalism, in politics then?
I did. I grew up, in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is right outside Washington, D.C., and, politics is in your blood if that happens. My mom, got the Washington Post on her doorstep every day. She read it cover to cover. As a matter of fact, when there was a story in the Washington Post about this book a few days ago, she said, I saw the story in the Post, and, sent me a picture of it. And so every time, there's a story in there, she makes sure she saves the clipping and sends it off to me. When I was a kid in the first grade, one of my very first field trips that I remember was seeing the hostages come home from Iran. And, it's one of those things where if you grow up in this area, you do things like that. My dad, working at his grocery store, I ran into people like Dick Gephardt, the former congressman. You would run into ambassadors and Washington Redskins players and senators and so on. And that also infused in me, some of the Potomac fever that I'm grappling with to this day. I consider it to be a blessing. I ran into a political operative years ago who said, "Oh, I'm so sorry that you had to grow up in the Washington, D.C. area." I'm actually really proud of being a D.C. native. I think it's a lot of fun, and you get access to the Smithsonian's down on the mall for free and that sort of thing, and lots of friends whose parents work in the government or work in politics. It was a great life growing up.
And how did you form an interest in journalism? When did that start?
Well, it's interesting. Some of this stuff I didn't put in the book because it's not a straight memoir, but I appreciate you asking the question. I was on the high school newspaper at my high school at Annandale High School in Northern Virginia. It was called the A-Blast because our team mascot was the Atoms. So the A-Blast was like, an atomic bomb. And one of the stories that I guess got my interest in journalism that I covered was over at my high school, they took down a mural to Pink Floyd on one of the walls in our high school. And it was a big mystery in the school. Where did the Pink Floyd mural go? And up on the wall instead was a mural of the Statue of Liberty. And as we found out, it was the French teacher who was responsible for taking down the Pink Floyd mural and putting up one for the Statue of Liberty. So I had to go down to the principal's office and say, it's my First Amendment right to, talk to the principal here and get some answers to my questions. But I guess if I had to put my finger on it, that would be one of those episodes. And right out of college, I worked on the assignment desk at Channel 5 here in D.C. I made $4.25 an hour, had no health benefits. And they would send me out to cover, drive-by shootings and things like that around Washington, D.C. Marion Barry, the old mayor, would show up and give a press conference. And so this got infused in my blood at a pretty early age.
You're White House correspondent for CNN in television reporting. That's, in a way, about as far as you can go. When did you form that ambition to reach that level of the business?
Well, I grew up covering, or watching, I should say, the likes of Sam Donaldson and Dan Rather and Wolf Blitzer, and I think I just, I saw those guys and I said, that's what I want to do. But I knew I had to work hard at it. I didn't come out of college and say, okay, put me on the network. I started in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a local station there, and from there went to Dallas, Texas, Chicago. And then after I worked in Chicago for a bit, I was hired by CBS News for their affiliate service, then went to CBS News and then CNN. So I went up the old-fashioned way in this business. I climbed the ladder from local news to where I'm at now.
Yeah. Why have you stayed with CNN? What does CNN stand for in your mind?
I think it stands for a commitment to top-notch journalism, and it's always been, I think, one of those news outlets, and it's been universally regarded, I think, in this fashion, as an outlet where you have a lot of brave journalists out there putting their lives on the line all over the world. We all remember when CNN was set up during the Persian Gulf War. Maybe some of our younger viewers don't remember that, but I remember that. And
I do.
And I know you do as well. And so CNN, I think, has, ever since Ted Turner came up with the idea for 24 News, has always had this commitment to very hard-nosed reporting. And, who could argue with having, 24 hours of news at your disposal as a journalist? It does make for a very satisfying but very challenging environment as a reporter. When you're on the White House beat at CNN, there are a lot of demands on you, but it's enriched my life, and I'm enormously grateful to the people at CNN, and I'm sure we'll cover it at some point, but CNN stood behind me during my whole press pass court case. And, there was a real commitment there inside the news organization to make sure that we stand up for what's right. And what happened in that case was, that my press pass was taken away, And some news organizations might have been, reluctant or wishy-washy as to what to do. There was no hesitation when it came right down to it. When they had to stand behind me, they did, and I'll always be enormously grateful for that.
What is the job of a White House correspondent? I think a lot of people think the job is the briefing room or the confrontations with the president, but I'm asking a simpler thing. What do you do all day?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's not just being in the briefing rooms and having those back and forths with the press secretary. My goodness, that's just a fraction of it. These days, being a White House correspondent is different than, say, for example, when I covered it during the Obama administration, the second term of the Obama administration. These days, we wake up, we look at our phones to see if the president's tweeted, and we're off to the races. And as I talk about in the book, often those tweets are fact-challenged. They are not dealing with the real world. And so we have to almost immediately become fact-checkers from the moment we, wake up and before we've poured our first cup of coffee. And it's typically at that kind of frenetic pace until late at night when we go to bed, when we wait to see if the tweets are still going before we go to bed. I'm talking to a variety of sources all day long. I'm talking to White House officials on background. I'm talking to Republican sources up on Capitol Hill. I'm talking to Trump advisors on background. And we try to, through that process, put together our understanding of what the news is that day. We're also taking in all kinds of footage from the Hill, what Democratic leaders are saying, what's happening in the various investigations pertaining to the Russia probe and all these other probes attached to President Trump. And it is a messy, chaotic, exhausting challenge on a daily basis. But I think by the time the news comes on at the end of the day, we are doing a pretty good job at giving the American people accurate, reliable information, which is, after all, our job. Now, contrast that with when Barack Obama was president. We had regular briefings on a daily basis. And those briefings, yes, from time to time with Jay Carney or Josh Earnest, they would be contentious, I suppose, from time to time. But Josh Earnest gave so many briefings, and they were so long, they'd be an hour and a half long. It would almost be one of those, and this would happen from time to time. The Associated Press reporter would try to say, okay, thanks very much. And then Josh would say, well, let me take a couple more questions from the room. That doesn't happen anymore. And as folks know, as of this taping, we're roughly 90-plus days since our last official White House briefing in the White House briefing room. And we just don't have access to White House officials the way that we used to, even during the Trump administration, where we have them on the record in that briefing room where everybody is mic'd, and you have a variety of reporters, not just the networks who are vying to get a question in, but also print reporters from the wire services, newspapers, foreign news outlets. That has been lost for the last 3 months, and it's over the last 6 months. It's happened so rarely that this has, as a tradition here in Washington, has kind of gone away, and it's sad. I'd like to see it come back.
Yeah, I want to ask about that because when Josh Earnest stood there for even longer than you wanted and answered questions, he was doing that because it was the perception of the Obama administration and previous administrations that it was in the interests of the president to do this.
That's right.
They didn't do it because they were such believers in great journalism. They didn't do it because they wanted to help you do your stories. It was their belief that having daily briefings was important for the president. So it was a matter of self-interest. Why isn't there self-interest in having the briefing still? Why did that go away, do you think? Well,
one of the things I observed, and I talk about this in the book, one of the things I observed over the last 6 months or so, Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary, was finding herself in a position where either she was knowingly or unknowingly passing on false information to the American people. For example, when she said, and the White House said, that the president did not dictate the memo to the New York Times explaining Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with a Russian attorney at Trump Tower in 2016, and then we found out that the president had dictated that memo. Sarah Sanders was essentially caught in a situation where she had to explain away false information that had been given to the public. Same thing happened with the Stormy Daniels case. Sarah Sanders was in the briefing room having to answer questions about why false information, inaccurate information had been given to the American people prior to some revelations happening in the Stormy Daniels case. And as Sarah was saying in the briefing room, well, I'm just giving you the best information that I have at the time. As we later found out in the Mueller report, there was one instance where Sarah Sanders admitted to federal investigators that she essentially gave false information as to why James Comey, the fired FBI director, was let go. She had said that he had lost the faith and the confidence of multiple FBI agents. She admitted to federal investigators that that was not entirely accurate. And so there have been episodes, I think, where they've been caught giving the American people false information. My sense is that they realized that that was not an asset, that was a liability. And so now what we have in its place, Jay, is we have a situation where Sarah Sanders or other top officials will go out under the north lawn of the White House to where the live positions take place on Pebble Beach, and I talk about this in the book. They'll do an exclusive interview, typically with Fox News. Then they'll walk back to their offices inside the White House, and we in the press have to gather in the driveway in the hopes that they'll stop and talk to us and answer some of our questions. It's an environment that's really tilted in their favor now because, you know, she can essentially say, well, that's all the time that I have. I've got to get out of here. She almost sounds like a cable news host. And she'll say, that's all the time that I have. I've got to go back inside. And she'll take maybe 4 or 5 questions. There have been episodes, I suppose, where, you know, she's taken more than that. But it's not the same as when we have them in the briefing room. Everybody's mic'd up. The cameras are on. The lights are on. There's a stenographer there recording things for the record. My understanding is that most of these driveway gaggles, and I don't know if a lot of folks have focused in on this, there's no stenographer present typically taking notes. In the White House briefing room, there's a stenographer, and the public may not be aware of this. There's a stenographer there taking notes and holding a microphone and a recorder up so we can have an accurate reflection of what is said in the back and forth of that briefing room. We don't really have that anymore in these driveway gaggles. There's no public record that you can go back to and say, well, on this date in this driveway gaggle, Sarah Sanders said this. Whereas before we had that sort of thing. And so the environment has changed greatly, and I don't think the public is as well served as they were when we had those briefings.
A lot of the president's tweets amount to disinformation. They often have, as you noted, factual errors in them. They can be huge distractions to what is really going on that day in Washington. A lot of people that I talk to, because I criticize the press, I talk to people online all day long about media coverage. A lot of people wonder, why don't you just ignore or downplay the president's tweets? Why let them drive you to distraction like this? Why not just ignore them?
It's a great question, Jay, and I talk about this from time to time in the book. We have been grappling with just how to cover this very unprecedented presidency, unconventional presidency from the get-go. And this goes back to the campaign, because remember, these tweets and these false statements were flying all around during the campaign. I remember during the campaign when the president, then candidate Trump, called into question the nation's unemployment rate that was generated by the Labor Department. He hinted that Ted Cruz's father was involved in the Kennedy assassination. He's obviously infamously known for saying that Barack Obama wasn't born in this country, which is obviously a flat-out lie. And then he carried this act into the White House, and we saw very early on in the administration where the president trying to explain how he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, saying that 3 million undocumented immigrants voted illegally in the 2016 election, and that's why he lost the popular vote. Well, there's no evidence of that. There's no proof of that. And so what do you do as a journalist? And I talk about this during the book. I call it a game of what would you do. Do you ignore a flat-out falsehood like that, or do you correct the record? As we know, Jay, the Washington Post fact-checker recently discovered that the president has uttered approximately 10,000 false or misleading statements. I'm not sure where the number is now as of this taping, since he came into office. And that has made us fact-checkers in real time. We spend a lot of our time and energy fact-checking the president's statements and tweets, and this upsets the president, upsets his team, upsets a lot of Trump supporters out there who sometimes lash out at us in ways that make us feel endangered and threatened. But Jay, my question to the viewer is, and the folks online who talk with you, is, my goodness, what would this world be like 2 years in had we not been fact-checking the president and exhausting ourselves chasing these so-called bright, shiny objects? Had we not been fact-checking him, what would be our concept of reality today? What would be our concept of the truth? There needs to be, and I think folks recognize this across our industry, there needs to be a common sense of what the truth is and what reality is. And I think if we had spent the last 2 years ignoring the tweets or not talking about the tweets and some of the things that he says, we could talk about this during this interview, which are clearly driven to change up the news cycle and benefit him politically. But at the same time, we can't just let falsehoods stand. We can't just let lies go without being checked. I don't think we would be doing our job at that point.
Yeah. Well, let me ask the question a different way.
Yeah.
It has been a premise of people doing your job that what the president says is news.
Yeah.
Do you think that's still a fair standard? Does that still apply?
It is, and I don't want to date this interview too much, but when the president said to ABC's George Stephanopoulos that he would be open to receiving information from a foreign government, listen, that's news. That's not just news, that's disturbing information for the American people to receive. And did it throw off the news cycle? Did it just, throw us down the rabbit hole and force us through the looking glass again? Yes, of course. But my goodness, what are we supposed to do? Just sort of let that kind of thing stand and not analyze it, not fact check it, not talk about it, not bring back the things that the president has said in the past with respect to Russia and interference and so on. As I write in the book, in the chapter Russia, if you're listening, I was the one who asked that question at that press conference in Florida in 2016 that elicited that response. I asked the president, well, why won't you tell Putin to stay out of our democracy, out of our election process? And that is when he went on to say, Russia, if you're listening, if you could find Hillary Clinton's emails, you'd be rewarded mightily by our press. That's not an exact quote, I'm paraphrasing, but I think I've got it mostly right. I think that we are in this position right now where we have no choice but to report on what he says, what he tweets, because, as I said before, we can't have a situation in this country where our common sense of the truth and our common sense of reality is warped and thrown off because the president and what he says goes unchallenged. I just can't imagine a situation like that. And if somebody out there can build us a better mousetrap, I'm all ears. I'll be happy to listen. But my sense of it is, Jay, is that we are going to have to exhaust ourselves for as long as it takes to cover and fact check this president.
In January of 2016, you were taken off the White House beat and assigned to cover the Trump campaign. Why you, and why Trump? What was the logic of that assignment?
Well, I wanted to cover him. I was seeing what was happening at these rallies. I had, of course, like everybody else, absorbed and observed some of the rhetoric he was using out on the campaign trail. It appeared to me to be a campaign unlike anything we've seen in our lifetimes. A president who refers to Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals. A candidate who, made a plea for some kind of policy position where Muslims are banned from entering the United States. Those are unprecedented political stances and policy positions that that just run counter to anything we've seen in our lifetime covering politics. And so I wanted to get out there on the campaign trail, see what this was all about. And of course, as he was throwing out that red meat and using that kind of rhetoric, he was packing arenas with folks, clamoring for more. I just found that to be, a very interesting assignment. And, I wanted to cover this campaign and see what it was like, because my sense of it is that, something was changing in America out there on the campaign trail, and I wanted to go and observe it.
Did you think he could win?
I did not. I did not think he could win. I thought, but we went through this periodically during the campaign. When the president said, then candidate Trump said, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. When he said that John McCain was not a war hero. When he appeared to mock a disabled reporter from the New York Times. I thought, and then of course when Access Hollywood happened, I thought that the collective weight of those scandals would do him in, and as a candidate, and that just didn't happen. And as we saw,
and what illusion were you under then? Sorry to interrupt you, but what do you think you were assuming that wasn't true?
Well, we, as you and I both know, Jay, we've covered candidates and seen candidates out on the campaign trail for a generation now. These were all mistakes that it would have done in any other presidential candidate, and it didn't happen with this one. Now, there's a variety of reasons why that did not occur, but when I was at Trump campaign rallies, and he would say, I'd like to punch that protester in the face, that just struck me as something that, at some point you're not going to be able to get away with. But this was a part of the smashing of conventions and norms that helped him win the presidency. And one of the things I write about in the book is the people inside the Trump campaign were sitting there behind the scenes watching the coverage. And what they saw was, wow, when he goes out there and makes these kinds of outlandish comments, makes these outrageous remarks, it drives the coverage. It throws the news cycle off course and puts all of the attention on him. And of course, he noticed that as well. He's still using that technique to this day, which is why, I write in the book, I talked to a senior White House official who said, this is a president who rules by instability. He creates instability around him so that way he's in control of the chaos. And I think that we saw that pattern during the campaign. We're seeing it now during his presidency.
Okay. What do you think you, in the press, in the news media, maybe you specifically, Jim, got wrong about the 2016 election? Well,
and I talk about this in the book. One of the things that obviously, looking back, and folks at CNN and other news outlets have been very upfront about this, we probably should not have given then candidate Trump this gavel-to-gavel coverage where his rallies were covered end-to-end with no commercial interruption, in ways that the other candidates would have loved to have had. That was advertising money couldn't buy. And moving forward, I think what we've decided, I can't speak for everybody, but I think it looks like going into the 2020 campaign, we are not going to be covering those rallies end to end, in part because they're so factually challenged often that you can't really, fact check it as the words are coming out of his mouth. And so it may be better for the American people in terms of getting accurate, reliable information for us to cover this rally and then come to it afterwards and say, okay, Jim, what did the president say there? What did he have to, say to those folks in that arena? And in addition to having a campaign reporter there, having fact checkers. We just recently hired Daniel Dale, who is a terrific fact checker with the Toronto Star, now with CNN. And you know him, Jay. He's there live tweeting all of this stuff and fact checking these things in real time. He has sort of this encyclopedic knowledge now of everything the president has said, and he has this incredible ability to fact check things almost immediately, as he says, because he's heard these things over and over again. And so I think what you're going to see going into 2020 is the coverage really get tailored to the time that we're in right now, which is a time when people think they're entitled to their own set of facts. To paraphrase Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. These days, people feel like they're entitled to their own set of facts, and if you're going to be, in the business, as I like to say, of not just reporting the news but defending the truth, we have to be able to be smarter and savvier, folks in this business when it comes to providing information to the American people and covering these candidates.
What do you think Trump and his team had right about the news medium?
Well, I talk about this in the book. When I had an interview with Steve Bannon, we talked over the phone, and he describes it this way, and not to get too professorial with the professor there, but he says that Donald Trump was really a Marshall McLuhan type candidate. The medium is the message. And what Donald Trump understood during the 2016 campaign, according to Steve Bannon, was that if you drive the narrative, you can control the campaign news cycle. And essentially that is what Donald Trump did. And that is a lesson that they took away from that campaign and have applied to the presidency. As Bannon puts it, and I write in the book, this was how he was able to cut through 16 candidates, like a lawnmower going across the front lawn, like a scythe through grass. And I think he's right about that. I think he understood, and I think the campaign understood, that the media, by and large, is going to chase what the news is that day. And if you have, and so in 2016, if you have a candidate saying all these outlandish, outrageous things, it is going to draw attention. Now, folks will say, well, what about you guys at CNN? That's all you guys did. Let's go back. Let's remember there were other news outlets, other networks covering this candidate prominently, just as we were. New York Times, Washington Post, major newspaper websites had Donald Trump stories all over their main page. We were all consuming the same information and delivering it almost in the same fashion, these OMG headlines that he would create on a daily basis. And it did enable him, I think, to command the narrative during that campaign, no question about it.
You just used the phrase command the narrative. What is the narrative? What is that, the narrative?
It's a great question. Because it goes to these words that we use in Washington, which folks in other parts of the country are like, what is he talking about? Indeed. I think the narrative is what the common understanding is among journalists and political operatives and politicians, what the story is that day, and rightly or wrongly. And I think, for example, right now, the narrative or the item that is driving the news cycle is when the president said, well, I'm open to receiving information from a foreign government. That kind of comment is going to drive the quote-unquote narrative. Now, should it? Obviously, if you were to take a two-dimensional or paint a caricature of our coverage, you would say, well, you're just obsessed with that. That's all you're doing all day long. That's not the case. We have reporters out there on a daily basis working very hard to, work on other items that are out there, on the agenda. What's happening down at the border, what's happening with the environment. We have great international correspondents and teams overseas reporting on the news. And all of that is thrown into the mix, and we try to put a newscast on that is balanced, but no question about it, there are items that drive the coverage on a daily basis, and I would say that is, I'm not writing this down and handing you a term paper in a week from now, but just off the top of my head, that is probably the best explanation I can come up with as to what the daily narrative is on a daily basis.
Do you know for a fact, by which I mean from your reporting, that neither Trump nor his family ever thought he would win?
Based on my reporting, talking to my sources, they did not think they were going to win that election. And I will tell you a story. When I ran into Ryan Priebus on the morning of Election Day, he said to me, it's going to take a miracle for us to win. And proceeded to say, listen, when Access Hollywood happened, we thought that was it. Now, what we saw during the tail end of that campaign, obviously the dynamic changed. When the Comey letter came out 11 days before the election, the letter saying that the FBI, James Comey, the former FBI director, then FBI director, was saying we're reopening parts of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. What I noticed was the polls sort of coming to a screeching halt, the momentum for the Clinton campaign coming to a screeching halt, and there was a sense of confidence that Donald Trump had at the very tail end of that campaign that probably was not being measured accurately by the polls. If things are changing a week out before an election, I think it's difficult for the polling to reflect that in the last few days of a campaign. And it seemed that there was a swing in his direction at that point. I think that there was a sense inside the campaign, in the last month of October there before the November election, that they were in big trouble because of that Access Hollywood controversy. Things obviously changed there at the very end. Now, had we known about the Stormy Daniels case, had that been in the news cycle, had Michael Cohen and the president not come up with this scheme to conceal that, had that been known right before the election, that could have changed it again. But of course, we can't go back and imagine what would have happened accurately. But that certainly would have been a game changer, I think, right at the very end of that campaign, had the public known about that.
Do you remember your thoughts and emotions on the day after the election when it was clear that Trump had won and that you were probably going to be covering Donald Trump in the White House? Do you remember what you felt then was ahead for you and the rest of the press?
Yes. My concern, Jay, was that, first of all, when I saw all the red hats come out at 3 o'clock in the morning on election night, that a nationalist president had arrived on the scene and that we were about to see something we'd never seen before. I knew that we were in for it in terms of having a contentious relationship with the incoming administration. When I talked to a communications aide that night and said, well, now that we've won, maybe we'll get better coverage. I mean, even after they won, they still were aggrieved, as I write in the book. But the concern that I had during the campaign, Jay, when the president would go out there and call us the disgusting news media, the dishonest news media, liars, scum, criminals, and so on, in front of thousands of cheering supporters, my concern was that this act was about to be rolled right into the Oval Office, and it was. And as we saw at that press conference on January 11, 2017, when he called me and my news organization Fake News, he was fully prepared to continue to escalate this rhetoric aimed at the news media. And my concern during the campaign was that somebody might get hurt. I had people coming up to me and saying all sorts of things at some of these rallies. I remember one day finding on one of the press tables a sign, and I held this up on CNN, that had a swastika next to the word media. And I remember thinking at the time, my goodness, if there are folks out there who would equate us with Nazis, that would potentially invite somebody to do something terrible to a reporter. And so I became concerned very early on during the campaign. And people say, oh, that's just words, that's just rhetoric. No, that's disturbing. I've covered 4 presidential campaigns. I've never seen that level of hostility and that kind of rhetoric aimed at the press before. Yes, individually here and there might be anecdotes and that sort of thing. But if you talk to people who are experienced campaign reporters, experienced political reporters, we had never seen anything like that during that campaign. And this escalated in the presidency.
Right.
Sorry.
Did you think that the office would change him, would tame this kind of behavior, that he would become sort of more friendly to the establishment, that he would begin to behave like other presidents?
Well, I write about that in the book, Jay. You'll remember at that time there were all these pundits and folks who are from the conventional wisdom corner of Washington, D.C., and presidential historians and so on, who thought, well, maybe the office, when the weight, and the majesty of the presidency rested upon the shoulders of Donald J. Trump, he would turn into something like Ronald Reagan. My concern was, having watched that campaign and covered that campaign and absorbed that hostility out on the campaign trail, I thought there was no way that was going to happen, and that this was a unique president who was coming into office, who understood how he could control the news cycle, how he could change the narrative, manipulate the media, and if it meant attacking members of the press, he was going to continue to do that. And that's exactly what happened. When we had that press conference at Trump Tower at January 11, 2017, our news organization broke that story that the president-elect had been told by the U.S. intelligence community that the Russians might have compromising information on him, and that might be used against him as president. He came out into that press conference and called that fake news. He was saying that up was down and black was white, and real was fake, and that just wasn't the case. So in addition to the bullying of the press and demonizing of the press, we saw an assault on the truth that day. That also was a hallmark of his rise to power, saying that Barack Obama wasn't born in this country, and all of these other things that he said during the campaign. And that was also a concern of mine going into this administration, that he was going to play fast and loose with the facts and the truth. And that, folks will say, well, why do you cover the tweets, and why do you do this, and why do you do that? It really felt like the campaign had continued right on into 2017, that the campaign never really stopped. And that is essentially how he behaves. He behaves as if he's still campaigning. We had rallies. Remember, we had rallies during the transition. And I was thinking to myself, why are we having a rally during the transition period? Don't they have to get an administration up and running? He just loves being out there at these rallies. It's his happy place, as I describe it in the book. And he's, I think, conducted his presidency as if the campaign never stopped.
What is the Washington establishment, and do you consider the news media to be part of it?
I suppose so. I mean, one of the reasons why I write in the book about my blue-collar roots is, you hear folks like Steve Bannon refer to us as elitist and so on. It was a long time before I flew in business class or rode the Acela. I certainly don't consider myself to be an elitist, and I certainly wasn't that growing up. But there is a Washington establishment, I suppose. The cocktail party circuit, politicians, political operatives, members of the press, and so on. I suppose the president might refer to those folks as the swamp. But these days, it's the same swamp, different alligators. And you see that the conservative news media in this town has a much more prominent role in Washington. And so there is such a thing, I suppose, as the Washington establishment. It's not like some secret society where you have a secret handshake and you go through a secret door, and all of a sudden you're in this room with all these folks. I as a kid growing up, kind of on the outside looking in, because I had blue collar parents and so on. I wasn't the son of a diplomat or the son of a senator or anything like that. I've always thought that there was this Washington establishment, and I suppose there is one, but it's not as cartoonish or two-dimensional as I think folks think.
Do you think the intimacy between journalists and the Washington establishment might be one of the reasons there is such rage at the press, or there is a resentment of the press that the president could take advantage of?
Well, that's a great question, Jay. I think that, yes, I think that there is a coziness there that people have picked up on, that they've detected, and that they're irritated by. But I will say, and this may sound corny, and folks may not believe this, but the journalists that I work with over at the White House and out on the campaign trail, these are very dedicated, hardworking people. Young millennials with their laptops in their laps at 1 a.m, banging out pieces for the next day's newspaper or for a digital piece that'll go on a website. We're out there covering these campaigns until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and then getting up at 5 a.m, getting on a plane and going off to the next city. These are some hardworking, very smart and dedicated folks. There really isn't enough time, Jay. I mean, this is one of the things that maybe folks don't quite understand, but I'd love to explain it. There's not really enough time to be part of this so-called Washington establishment club for a lot of us reporters out there. So this notion that we're, these fat cats scratching each other's backs, I think that's an exaggeration. I think that is not taking into consideration that you have a lot of hard-working, dedicated people who are very dedicated to the idea that the American people deserve to have honest, reliable, accurate information, who are striving very hard day in and day out with a team of editors, producers, and so on, executives, making sure that the information that the American people receive is accurate and reliable. And folks may say, oh, hogwash, you're just there, lining your pockets and upping your Twitter account. If folks want to be that pessimistic and that cynical about it, I suppose I can't change their minds. But that is not why I'm in this business. That's not why I do this on a daily basis. And I know that there are lots of other folks who are also working in this profession who feel the same way.
You write in the book quite a few times about off-the-record briefings and events that you go to, drinks at a congressman's office and chatter with them. Why do people want to speak to you off the record?
Well, a lot of times they want to speak to us off the record because they're fearful of being quoted on the record or having their name out there attached to something that they don't want their name attached to. And so I think what folks don't understand when the president says, well, these anonymous sources that people have out there, it's baloney. Nothing could be further from the truth. We've, for years talked to press secretaries who go out into the briefing room and speak on the record and then go back to their office and call you on the phone and say, can I speak on background or can we talk off the record for a second? And a lot of times they're trying to fill in the blanks in our reporting and give us some context. A lot of times they're trying to spin us and sell us a bill of goods, and we have to be mindful of that, and that's why you need to have a variety of sources and so on that you're talking to. But it is a tool that flacks use, that operatives use to relay information to us, and we have to be mindful of that. I always try to get folks on the record during this book. I talked to Kellyanne Conway for an hour, and she says, she doesn't agree with the president's use of the term the enemy of the people. She says she doesn't agree with the practice of separating kids from their parents at the border. She tries to correct the record in terms of why she said alternative facts. She says it was because she mushed together alternative information and additional facts. And I try my best to get folks on the record, and that's why going back to the briefings is so important. We need to get these officials on the record. My goodness, we're paying their salaries. It's the least they can do. But sometimes sources have to speak on background because they're relaying information to us that would get them in trouble if they were to talk about it on the record. And that information, in some cases, in many cases, is vital to the American people.
Why is Kellyanne Conway on CNN so much?
Well, she's the counselor to the president. She is one of the senior-most officials in the administration. I think when she uttered the phrase alternative facts, she took a hit to her credibility, and it's lasted to this day. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to her for this book. What folks don't maybe quite understand about this book is it also covers the first 2 years of the administration. And Kellyanne Conway was a pretty large figure in the first 2 years of this administration. She went out there and said alternative facts to try to clean up what Sean Spicer said when he came into the briefing room on the first full day of the administration and said that the president had the largest inauguration crowd in the history of the United States, something that was just a total falsehood. And Kellyanne Conway, a couple of days later, goes, or I think maybe the next day, goes on Meet the Press and uses that term alternative facts to try to explain it away. The president has not only thrust us in the press in this unprecedented situation of having to correct his falsehoods, he's thrust his own staff into the unfortunate position of times of explaining away his falsehoods. And, they were just in almost a rage over the reporting on the crowd size in those first few days of the administration. And that's when she said that. She went on to make other mistakes in talking to us about various things. She talked about a Bowling Green massacre at one point that didn't exist. I talk about that in the book. And we have her on CNN from time to time. I can't speak on behalf of every time that she's come on, but we're, I think, always hopeful that we can get straight answers. And what I found to be so interesting, Jay, when I talked to her, was here's somebody who has been criticized for not being straightforward, for being, a little over the top, maybe a lot over the top in defending this president. And here she was in instance after instance, acknowledging disagreements with the president on certain things. And I found that to be, interesting and valuable to the reader, and that's why I included it in the book.
How would you characterize solidarity within the White House press corps?
I think it's pretty good. Now, is it perfect? No. We're competitive journalists, and we're all trying to get the scoop or trying to get the story, and so that creates a very competitive environment, and it doesn't make for the greatest show of solidarity at times. But take my press pass case, for example. When the White House suspended my press pass, we had just about every news organization in Washington standing behind CNN as we took the administration to court, even Fox News, and I thought that that was a great display of solidarity. And as I write in the book, there were members of the White House Correspondents Association who went to Sarah Sanders and said, you're going to unite the press corps with this, and that's exactly what happened. And so, are there times when there isn't enough solidarity? Sure, of course, but I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is a greater display of solidarity as time has gone on, because I think we've realized, if we don't hang together, they're going to play divide and conquer, and that's what they have done at times.
The president expresses his irritation and exasperation and disgust with CNN all the time. He's called you fake news. He has obviously a thing for you yourself. A lot of people wonder, if he despises your network and maybe even you as a professional that much, why does he call on you?
It's a great question. And as I talk about in the book, there was that press conference in February of 2017 where the president calls me very fake news. And then after the press conference is over, Hope Hicks calls and says, Jim, I just want you to know that the president thought you were very professional today and said Jim gets it. And I thought to myself, well, what is that all about? And I talked to some sources, and they were all essentially saying what I have suspected for a long time, that this was an act. And what has happened over the last couple of years is that this act of trolling and taunting the press for political gain has gotten out of the president's control. It has gotten out of his control, and now we're seeing, this, he gets upset with us, his team gets upset with us, his supporters get upset with us, to the point, and the vast majority of Trump supporters are wonderful people, but there are some self-described Trump supporters who lash out at us in ways that make us feel endangered, and I write about this in the book, where there are death threats coming in to my social media accounts, death threats coming in via email. The person who sent the pipe bomb to CNN and Democratic officials around the country, that individual had been threatening me on Twitter and leaving death threats that said, you're the enemy of America, you're next. There was one tweet that featured the grisly image of a decapitated goat's head. And we didn't realize this until after this individual was caught in that white van covered in anti-media signage. And so, yes, I think what began as an act has mutated into a full-blown assault on the press, where he calls us the enemy of the people. And as I've been trying to say to folks, and one of the messages of my book is, do we want to have a country where the press is referred to as the enemy of the people? You and I in a country where our parents and grandparents said we want to leave a country to our kids and grandkids that's better than the one that we found. Now, are we really doing that right now, when we have an environment where the press, where segments of American society are referred to as the enemy of the people? I would argue that we're heading down an uncertain path. And my concern is that you could have a situation where a reporter is hurt or, God forbid, killed, and at that point, Jay, the United States enters a different category of nations. It enters a category of nations where the press, members of the press, don't feel safe doing their jobs. And, that could put a real chilling effect on democracy. It could put a real chilling effect on the First Amendment and the free press of this country. And the concern that I have, and the reason why I wrote this book, is to sort of wave the caution flag and say, folks, is this the kind of country we want to hand off to the next generation?
You said, when reflecting on that February press conference, that this is an act of the president's.
Yeah.
If it's an act, it certainly incorporates you and your profession in the theater. Mm-hmm. So why not just leave? Why not just exit? I wrote a piece the day after Spicer's ran in the briefing room called "Send the Interns," in which I recommended that thank you, that people, experienced people like yourselves, go outside in, send people who aren't as experienced into the briefing room, and because the real action is elsewhere. But if you're part of this act, as you put it, why not quit? Exit from that theater?
Well, I think it's a great question, and you make a great point. It's a terrific point. And, a couple of things on that. One is I don't feel like I'm a willing participant in any kind of reality TV style act. I'm a reporter covering this president, and we're all grappling with how to cover it. Having said that, I will point you to the press conference, the press briefing that we had with Sarah Sanders, where she refused to disagree with the president that we are the enemy of the people. And when she gave what I thought was a very unsatisfactory answer to that question, I got up and I left the briefing room. And, I think that, we probably should have gotten up out of that briefing room a little more from time to time when we were being told these whoppers and these lies. Folks struggle with, using the word lie. We've been lied to. The American people has been lied to, and in unprecedented ways. And it's made for a very challenging environment for journalists. Having said all of that, if we were to send in the interns, and there are some terrific interns, probably some interns smarter than me, Jay, but as you know, and you probably received some of this feedback when you wrote the story, if you send an intern in with a list of questions and they don't get that answer the first time, they may not be experienced enough, and I certainly wasn't when I got right out of college, wasn't experienced enough to ask the follow-up question, to continue to press, to realize that you do have the ability to interject if a press secretary or a president is BSing you at that particular moment. And so, it's not a perfect science. And, I wish we could build a better mousetrap as to how to cover this presidency. But my sense of it is, having done this for 3 years now, is that we're just going to have to power through this, doing this in the best way possible. It's a collaborative process inside each and every news organization. When I go in there and I do my job, I may get feedback from time to time that says, hey, Jim, that was a good question, but perhaps you could have asked it this way, or perhaps you could have read the quote to them at that particular moment. If they're playing fast and loose with the facts, you could say, but hold on, Mr. President, you said this, or hold on, Sarah Sanders, you said this in the past. And, we've seen that from time to time from reporters. You say, well, you did say this at this particular point. So it's not a perfect science. We're always trying to trim the sails. But my sense of it is, and we don't have a briefing on a regular basis anymore, so there is no briefing to send the interns to. But if we ever get back to that point, I think we're going to still have to have experienced journalists in there to know, wait a minute, my BS detector is going off. I better, jump in here and try to ask this question a different way.
I remember when you got up and walked out of the briefing room, and I just think, what would happen if the entire press did that at once? It's an image in my mind that I do wonder what the results of that would be. But we're out of time, Jim. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for writing the book in the first place, and thanks for joining us on C-SPAN.
Jay, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope folks pick it up and think deeply about what I've got to say there, and I appreciate the time.